Hi there, this is Matt Heffernan. Welcome back to my channel. From the late 1980s until around 2010, mass marketing of computers and gaming devices included bus widths, of all things, as the foremost metric of a product's speed and sophistication. During what we now call the 8-bit era, pretty much all home computers and gaming consoles had 8-bit processors, usually the market-leading 6502 or Z80, with some holdouts using the Motorola 6809. There were exceptions, of course, like the Texas Instruments TI-99 4A and the Mattel Intellivision, which used unique 16-bit processors that were not used in any other products like these. But almost nobody today would think of the Intellivision as the first 16-bit home console. Rather, there were two competing consoles that loudly proclaimed their 16-bit status when they both arrived in the North American market in the August of 1989, the Sega Genesis and the NEC TurboGrafx 16. In Japan, they were known as the Mega Drive and PC Engine, respectively, and were attempts at getting 16-bit capabilities in contemporary arcade games to the home gamer. But why was 16 suddenly showing up in big shiny numbers on the consoles when the average consumer had no idea that they were living in an 8-bit world? The North American home video gaming market was completely dominated by the Nintendo Entertainment System by 1989. Commanding a much larger market share than even the original Famicom in Japan, which had more serious competition at home. And there was no doubt that the NES was a true 8-bit machine, using the 6502-based Ricoh 2A03 CPU, in a time when home computing was shifting to 16-bit and 32-bit platforms, and arcade gaming had progressed far beyond the NES's capabilities. Sega and NEC had a lot of success with their systems in Japan, but they needed to better differentiate themselves from the NES, especially for parents who were reluctant to shell out for a new console just a couple years after buying the NES, which was at its peak of popularity. North American marketing latched onto the 16-bit designation as a way of showing that these new systems are twice as good as the stodgy old 8-bit NES. The enhanced graphics and sound of these systems were obvious, but identifying a generational shift that Nintendo hadn't moved on yet was the biggest selling point. The Super Famicom was still in the middle of its long development process, and wouldn't arrive in North America as the Super NES until 1991, just over 2 years after the release of the Genesis, which also quickly overtook the TurboGrafx 16 with a much larger software library, and held on to become the market leader even after the SNES came out. But wait, what does it even mean to be 8-bit, or 16-bit? Or for that matter, 32-bit or 64-bit? By 2010, the home and business computer markets had mostly migrated to 64-bit machines and software, thanks to the marketing efforts of the previous decade. There are still some non-PC systems that are 32-bit, or even still 16-bit and 8-bit, but that just isn't part of the marketing anymore. Now we mainly have a nostalgia market for 8-bit and 16-bit gaming, without a real understanding of the distinctions, which were clouded by marketing that hovered somewhere between naive and misleading. Let's take a step back and actually define these terms in a technical sense. A bit, of course, is a single binary digit, 0 or 1, which for hardware means a conductor that is either at a low or high voltage. As computers were invented for doing math quickly, the CPU needs the ability to deal with numbers as a sequence of bits. In 1971, the very first microprocessor, the Intel 4004, simplified this to just 4 bits, meaning numbers could range from 0 to 15. So to make a functional calculator, it had to do a lot of 4-bit operations to deal with larger numbers, including numbers with decimal points and exponents. Since those had to be broken down into 4-bit segments, it took a lot of operations to do pretty much anything. Big mainframe computers at the time, like the IBM System 360, didn't use microprocessors, but rather large circuit boards with the discrete components as their central processing units. And they could actually deal directly with 32-bit integers and 64-bit floating point values in the 1960s. Of course, these were massive, room-filling machines, and features like this on a microprocessor weren't available until the late 1980s. So when home computers first came out in the late 1970s, they were 8-bit machines. They dealt with numbers as 8-bit values, both internally and externally. This is illustrated by the concept of a bus, which is just a way of describing a bunch of wires or other conductors that hold a binary value, with the number of bits in the value equaling the number of conductors. A microprocessor needs to have two data buses, one on the outside connected to pins on the chip that get data in and out of the processor, whether that's from memory or some other component like a keyboard or a disk drive, and one on the inside to bring number values from those pins into the internal processing, where it can be stored in registers or have some mathematical or logical operation performed on it. These were 8-bit CPUs because they had 8-bit data buses on both the inside and the outside. These machines also had address buses, usually with 16 bits, as 64 kilobytes of memory was a lot more useful than just 256 bytes. But we don't call them 16-bit CPUs because of this. Not even the Z80, which has 16-bit registers and has instructions that can do 16-bit math. Inside, it's still dealing with data 8 bits at a time, and those 16-bit instructions take a lot longer to do than their 8-bit counterparts. When IBM released its 5150 personal computer in 1981, it was the debut of 16-bit microcomputers in the business world at first, and eventually in the home market. But was it really a 16-bit computer? It wasn't really marketed as such, with the big drive to differentiate 16-bit systems in marketing not coming until the end of the decade, when at that point 32-bit PCs were taking over the market with 8386-based IBM clones. The original PC had an 8088 CPU, which was the second chip Intel produced in their 16-bit series that started with the 8086, which never found widespread use in the personal computer market. There's no question that the 8086 is a 16-bit processor, with both internal and external 16-bit data buses, and even a 20-bit address bus, allowing a memory space of a full megabyte. But it was somewhat expensive to deal with, as the 16 data pins also had to do double duty as the address pins, requiring external logic to multiplex them into separate buses. The 8088 simplified this a bit by making the external data bus only 8 bits, which required less multiplexing and only having to route an 8-bit data bus around the system and operate with other inexpensive chips that were already designed to work with 8-bit systems. But on the inside, it was still a proper 16-bit CPU. It did 16-bit math and single internal operations, but had to take a little longer to fetch 16-bit data values, as they could only come in 8 bits at a time. But yet, because of this bottleneck, some people still insist on calling the 8088 an 8-bit processor, and the original IBM PC, XT, and their clones 8-bit computers. So which is it? Let's take a look at systems that were explicitly labeled 16-bit. The Sega Mega Drive and Genesis consoles had a big 16-bit label prominently featured on them. There was no missing it. But was it really a 16-bit system? Well, that's a bit complicated. First, let's take a look at the CPU. They had a Motorola 68000, which is definitely at least a 16-bit processor. Both its internal and external data buses are 16 bits, but Motorola marketed it as a 16/32-bit processor, as also reflected in the name of the Atari ST computer, with the ST standing for 1632. Internally, the original 68000 only had a 16-bit data bus, but it did have 32-bit registers and additional logic units to deal with 32-bit addresses, even though it only had a 24-bit external address bus. But calling the 68000 32-bit would be just like calling the Z80 16-bit. It's simply not accurate. The physical lines aren't there in either of the data buses. So Sega doubled down on the 16-bit branding, as that was undeniable, and could have even been seen as underselling it. But then again, the Genesis is not 16 bits all over. It also has a Z80 that serves two purposes. For Genesis games, it controls the sound hardware, but if you have the power-based converter, it can be used to play Sega Master System games as well, without the need for Z80 emulation. So it has a complete 8-bit system inside it, and still relies on it for part of the processing. Let's take a look now at the other 16-bit console that came out at the same time, the NEC PC engine, or TurboGrafx 16. This system had a custom CPU made by NEC's development partner Hudson Soft, called the HUC6280. This chip was based on the WDC65CO2, a processor you are probably very familiar with if you've been watching my channel. And this should give you pause. How could NEC possibly call this a 16-bit system? Hudson Soft didn't expand the data bus to 16 bits. They simply added a few features like a memory management unit and a programmable sound generator. So what gives? Well, it did have two 16-bit video processing chips, but they would still have an 8-bit bottleneck when used with the CPU, not unlike the Commander X16 and its Vera display adapter. So while it has 16 in its name, it's being marketed as an 8-bit computer, which is now a selling point for the nostalgia-driven market, also known as old people like me. Things get weirder when we get to the PC market, which became fully 16-bit in the early 1990s, as all the legacy 8-bit systems like the Commodore 64 and Apple II started leaving the market. But new PCs were shipping with Intel 8386 and 486 processors, which were definitely designed and marketed on their own as 32-bit CPUs. But software had not yet caught up. Microsoft Windows exploded in popularity in 1990 when version 3 came out just as these more powerful processors were becoming more affordable. But it was still merely a 16-bit graphical environment, sitting on top of the legacy MS-DOS operating system, which was still backwards compatible with the original 8088. At best, Windows 3 added some software-based memory management using the monolithic 32-bit addressing capability of the 386, instead of the legacy segmented memory scheme that limited earlier processors to 640 kilobytes of RAM. But for a while, the market was dominated by 32-bit computers that ran 16-bit software and still had a lot of 8-bit peripherals. The shift hadn't really happened yet. By the mid-1990s, new options arrived for taking better advantage of these 386 class machines, especially as 486 and Pentium-based systems were hitting the market, providing faster versions of this 32-bit architecture with higher clock speeds and more performance-enhancing features. Microsoft, depending on how you count them, developed 2 or 3 different 32-bit operating systems. The flagship project was called Windows NT, an entirely new 32-bit OS designed to take full advantage of the 386 architecture. Before that, however, Microsoft teamed up with IBM to develop OS/2, but that partnership deteriorated due to the success of Windows, and IBM ended up releasing the 32-bit OS/2 2.0 by themselves in direct competition with Windows NT. Meanwhile, Microsoft was also working on a more backwards compatible version of Windows that could run all of the old 16-bit DOS and Windows software, as well as new 32-bit software, and this became Windows 95, which at least had the outward appearance of being a proper operating system, and not just another graphical shell on top of a new version of MS-DOS, which is basically what it was. Also arriving in 1995 was another competitor, as Red Hat introduced their first Linux distribution, which was the first to find wide use, even showing up as commercially pressed CD-ROMs. But you could also download it for free off the rapidly expanding World Wide Web. The fact that all of these operating systems were 32-bit and enabled things like preemptive multitasking, or at least the appearance of it, were a big part of the marketing, and by the new millennium, the entire PC business was 32-bit. Oddly enough, the 32-bit revolution in gaming consoles was not branded as such. The first true 32-bit gaming console was not from a single manufacturer, but was a standard promoted by EA founder Trip Hawkins called 3DO, and consoles were made by several companies, including Panasonic and Sanyo, all using the same 32-bit ARM CPU known as the ARM60. It was nearly $700 in the United States, but had very few games when it launched in 1993, and the ability of those games to exploit the 3D graphics acceleration was limited. The branding was very much based on the 3D capability, and the fact that it used a CD-ROM that could hold a lot more data than a cartridge. The other big 32-bit release in 1993 was the Atari Jaguar, but they instead decided to market it as a 64-bit system, including commercials screaming at the consumers to do the math. Perhaps Atari, as they were approaching bankruptcy, were banking on the inability of their customers to do basic math, because it's a real stretch to call the Jaguar 64-bit in any respect. At its heart is a Motorola 68000, which we saw earlier is really more of a 16-bit processor with some 32-bit features. It also had one of the first true GPUs, which Atari called Tom, which has a 32-bit RISC chip with some internal capability to work with 64-bit data. Then there was another chip called Jerry that was a 32-bit RISC digital signal processor that handled sound and some I/O control. So really, the Jaguar was a 32-bit system that was really more of a 16-bit system that a dying company was desperately trying to call a 64-bit system. It wasn't until 1994 that a truly successful 32-bit console came out, the Sony PlayStation. It was beat to the market by not one, but two 32-bit offerings from Sega, the Genesis add-on 32X system and the entirely new CD-based Saturn. Unsurprisingly, they canceled each other out, and Sony quickly dominated the market. Of the three, only the 32X made a big deal out of being 32-bit, which was a neat trick while still using the video and controller interfaces of the Genesis, which had its shiny 16-bit label covered by the 32X when it was installed. The 68,000 in the Genesis would kick off the program on the 32X ROM cartridge to run on the two 32-bit Hitachi SH2 RISC processors inside the add-on unit. This also came not too long after Sega introduced the Sega CD add-on unit, which could be connected to the Genesis at the same time as the 32X, allowing you to have a weird Frankenstein console. There were even a few games that required both the 32X and the Sega CD, but it all served to dilute the Sega brand, and putting out the Saturn at the same time did not help. Saturn had the benefit of having all new video and audio hardware, in addition to the same pair of SH2 processors as the 32X, and software only came on CD-ROM, which is what the market wanted. What the market didn't want was to pay $100 more for the Saturn than the PlayStation, which was a loss leader for Sony, as they went on to make a killing on software licensing. The PS1, as we know it today, had a MIPS R3000, which used a well-established 32-bit RISC architecture, with lots of development tools already on the market. Sony has been running away with the console market ever since, but a lion was sleeping. Nintendo was doing well with the aging 16-bit SNES, which had a Rico 5A22 based on the 65C816 processor, a 16-bit variant of the original 6502 core that powered the NES. But the market was slipping away, and Nintendo didn't have an offering for the 32-bit generation, or anything that used a regular CD. They were sitting on the first true 64-bit system, appropriately enough called the Nintendo 64. It used an NEC VR4300 CPU, which used the newer 64-bit MIPS architecture, as well as sticking with a ROM cartridge slot rather than optical media. This limited the size of the games, but made for a fast gaming experience without the characteristic loading times of the CD consoles of the era. It was also more kid-friendly, and had the outstanding launch title Super Mario 64. But unfortunately, that was fully half of the launch library, with only Pilot Wing 64 to round out the rest of the collection. More titles would come, with later ones taking even greater advantage of the N64's highly advanced 3D graphics, but requiring expensive cartridges to be manufactured by Nintendo seriously limited the diversity of titles, whereas the PS1 had countless developers putting out new CDs, often with much more mature and violent content that Nintendo continues to avoid today. Even though Nintendo made it here first, the market stopped caring about bus widths and focused more on the games themselves and the graphical capabilities of the consoles. Consoles since the N64 didn't advertise their bus widths at all. In fact, many of them continue to use 32-bit processors, including Nintendo's own successor to the N64, the GameCube, which used the 32-bit PowerPC-based Gecko processor from IBM. Sega never released a 64-bit console, ending their run in the home hardware market with the fondly remembered but ultimately unsuccessful 32-bit Dreamcast. The PlayStation 2's Emotion Engine CPU actually had an internal 128-bit bus, but only an external 16-bit bus for RAM. It did have a 64-bit direct connection to the graphics hardware, but all this makes it hard to give it a single bit count. Microsoft's first Xbox console was really just a PC in console clothing, sporting a 32-bit Pentium 3 CPU. That didn't last with the Xbox 360, which sports a custom CPU and GPU combo chip made by IBM called the Xenon, which actually has a 256-bit cache bus right on the die, along with 3 independent PowerPC cores that can do 128-bit vector operations. The PlayStation 3 had the similar cell broadband engine, while Nintendo came along with the humble Wii, which had just another 32-bit PowerPC processor, which enabled it to have backward compatibility with GameCube titles. At that point, the console market had completely lost interest in counting bits, but the PC market wasn't quite there. Shortly after the Wii came out, it became the preeminent home system with a PowerPC processor, as Apple abandoned the architecture in 2006 to adopt the newly released Intel Core 2 CPU, which used the x86-64 instruction set first developed by AMD. PC manufacturers were quickly adopting 64-bit processors from both AMD and Intel at the same time, and Microsoft already had a 64-bit version of Windows XP ready to go. Most Linux distros also had x86-64 builds at this time, and by the end of the decade, the 64-bit revolution quietly took over the entire PC market, all unified under a single architecture that also spread to enterprise servers, taking the vast majority of the market share from high-end server architectures from IBM and Sun Microsystems, soon to be bought by Oracle, which has their database software installed mostly on x86 systems rather than the SPARC architecture that they own. Windows 10 still supports the original 386 32-bit architecture, as do most Linux distros, but that is likely to fade as those 32-bit only computers find their way to the scrap heap. I would not be surprised if the next major version of Windows required a 64-bit processor. But I also would not be surprised to see this as the end of the line. 128-bit and higher processing is really only for special applications, and having a 64-bit address space means nearly limitless memory capacity, while 64-bit floating point numbers are more than accurate enough for anything but certain scientific applications. 64-bit integers are also ginormous, so seeing a general-purpose use case for 128-bit or higher CPUs is not easy. But nobody cares about bits anymore anyway. If you like technical discussions, you have found the right channel. Subscribe to get even more, and click the bell to be notified when new videos come out. I mostly look at 8-bit architectures, but if you want to continue the discussion on some of the chips I mentioned in this video, let me know in the comments, and click like if you want to see more overviews like this. If you just can't wait for that bell to ring to get more of this content, join our Patreon community, and see videos ad-free as soon as they are produced, just like the folks you see here, and support my ability to make more videos and games that tickle your nostalgia. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.